In the spring of 2002, in a rural town in Indiana, a sheriff's wife suddenly vanished, and the case quickly went cold. But 10 years later, one small detail reopened the case, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. The town of Oakhaven, Indiana, was the kind of deeply insulated, quiet community where people rarely locked their front doors. Surrounded by endless miles of flat, sprawling cornfields and dense, old-growth forests, it was a place where generations of families lived and died on the exact same streets. In Oakhaven, a person's reputation was their absolute most valuable currency, and no one in the entire county had a better reputation than Sheriff Mason Cole. Mason was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s. His hair was heavily salted with gray, and his eyes held the steady, unwavering calm of a man who had seen the absolute worst of human nature but still believed in the good. He had worn the Silver Star for nearly 20 years. He was not a politician in a uniform. He was a deeply dedicated lawman who knew every single local business owner by their first name, who stopped to help teenagers fix flat tires, and who treated everyone with profound, unconditional respect. But as much as the town respected Mason, they absolutely adored his wife. Rachel Cole was universally considered the warm, beating heart of the community. She was a 48-year-old woman with a bright, infectious smile and an incredible capacity for empathy. While Mason carried the heavy, often dark burden of the law, Rachel carried the emotional weight of the town. She volunteered 5 days a week at the local public library, organizing reading programs for young children, and personally delivering heavy stacks of books to elderly residents who could no longer drive. They were the absolute golden couple of Oakhaven. Their marriage was a beautiful, completely unshakable partnership built on decades of deep trust and quiet, comfortable routine. Their life together seemed ordinary, remarkably stable, and completely happy. They lived in a beautiful, modest farmhouse sitting on a few acres of quiet land just a few miles outside the main town limits. It was a life that felt completely safe from the chaotic, violent world Mason navigated on the job. But the terrifying reality of the world is that absolute safety is often just a fragile illusion. And on a beautiful, mild evening in late April, that illusion was completely, violently shattered. It was a Wednesday. The air was finally beginning to warm up after a long, bitter Midwestern winter. Rachel was spending the evening at the community center in town, organizing a massive charity fundraiser and book drive for the local elementary school. She had spent weeks preparing for the event, gathering donations and setting up heavy folding tables. Mason was working a late shift at the sheriff's department, handling a series of routine, completely mundane rural disputes. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, Mason picked up his heavy desk phone and dialed Rachel's cellular number. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was bright, energetic, and completely normal. She told Mason that the fundraiser had been a massive success, and that she was just finishing packing a few leftover cardboard boxes into the back of her dark blue sport utility vehicle. "I'm exhausted, but it was a wonderful night," Rachel told him, laughing softly. "I'm leaving right now. I will see you at home in about 15 minutes. I love you." Mason smiled, told her he loved her, and hung up the phone. It was a completely ordinary, entirely routine conversation. He had absolutely no idea it would be the very last time he would hear his wife's voice for an entire decade. Mason finished his paperwork, turned off the lights in his office, and drove his marked patrol cruiser back to their quiet farmhouse. He pulled into the gravel driveway at exactly 9 o'clock. The house was completely dark. Rachel's dark blue SUV was not parked in its usual spot near the front porch. Mason parked his cruiser and walked inside, turning on the kitchen lights. He wasn't immediately terrified. He knew Rachel was a deeply social woman. He simply assumed she had gotten caught up in a long conversation with one of the library committee members in the parking lot, or that she had stopped at the local grocery store to pick up something for breakfast. He took off his heavy gun belt, poured a glass of water, and sat down at the kitchen table to wait. 30 minutes passed. The quiet ticking of the wall clock began to sound incredibly loud in the empty house. At 9:45, a tiny, cold seed of worry began to take root in Mason's chest. The drive from the community center to their house was incredibly direct. It was a straight, 15-minute drive down a single, well-paved county road. There was absolutely no traffic in Oakhaven at this time of night. Mason picked up the kitchen phone and called her cellular number. The line rang 4 times and then went directly to her generic, automated voicemail. Mason hung up and dialed the community center. The phone rang endlessly in the dark, empty building. Everyone had clearly already gone home. By 10:15, the husband entirely vanished, and the veteran sheriff completely took over. Mason's sharp, deeply analytical mind began racing through the terrifying possibilities. A massive medical emergency, a severe car accident on the dark rural road, a blown tire leaving her stranded in a cellular dead zone. He immediately picked up his police radio and called the central dispatch. He did not sound panicked over the airwaves, maintaining his strict professional discipline, but he quietly ordered his 2 on-duty night deputies to immediately drive the length of County Road 9, the exact route Rachel would have taken home. Mason grabbed his heavy jacket, strapped his gun belt back on, and rushed out the front door. He threw his cruiser into gear and sped aggressively down the gravel driveway, his headlights cutting through the pitch-black Indiana night. He drove slowly along the shoulder of the road, rolling his window down, desperately scanning the deep, muddy ditches and the thick tree lines, praying he wouldn't see the crushed metal of her blue vehicle wrapped around an old oak tree. The heavy, suffocating silence of the rural county was completely deafening. At exactly 11:30, Mason's radio suddenly violently crackled to life. It was his youngest deputy. The young man's voice was incredibly tense, completely lacking its usual relaxed drawl. "Sheriff," the deputy said, the heavy static hissing beneath his words, "I'm about 4 miles outside of town. I have eyes on Rachel's vehicle. It's parked on the shoulder." Mason's heart completely stopped beating. He aggressively hit his emergency lights and sirens, tearing down the dark country road at over 90 miles an hour. He completely ignored the sharp turns, driven entirely by a massive, primal surge of pure adrenaline. Within 4 minutes, he saw the flashing red and blue strobes of the deputy's cruiser, illuminating the dark tree line ahead. Mason slammed his brakes, his heavy cruiser sliding slightly on the damp asphalt. He threw the door open before the vehicle had even completely stopped moving. He ran toward the dark blue SUV. What he saw completely paralyzed his entire body. It created a massive, horrifying psychological contradiction that defied absolutely every single instinct he had developed over 20 years in law enforcement. The dark blue vehicle was not sitting at the bottom of a ravine. It had not crashed into a tree. The tires were not flat, and there was absolutely no steam coming from the engine. The SUV was parked perfectly, flawlessly straight on the gravel shoulder of the quiet road. It looked exactly as if the driver had calmly, deliberately decided to pull over. Mason unclipped his heavy tactical flashlight and shined the bright white beam through the driver's side window. The car was completely, entirely empty. The driver's side door was entirely unlocked. Mason pulled it open. The silver keys were still sitting perfectly in the ignition. The engine was turned off, and the dashboard lights were dark. But as Mason frantically swept his flashlight across the interior of the vehicle, the absolute, terrifying mystery deepened into something completely incomprehensible. Rachel's heavy leather purse was completely gone. Her cellular phone was missing from the center console, and her light spring jacket was not resting on the passenger seat. Mason backed away from the vehicle, his breathing heavy and frantic. He shined his bright light onto the soft, muddy gravel directly outside the driver's door. There was absolutely no sign of a physical struggle. There were no deep, chaotic footprints in the mud. There were no scuff marks, no dropped items, and no shattered glass on the pavement. There was absolutely no blood. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. If Rachel had been violently ambushed by a predator waiting in the dark, she would not have had the time or the calm presence of mind to grab her purse, her phone, and her jacket before being dragged away. And if a monster had forced her out of the vehicle, they would have certainly left her personal belongings behind to avoid carrying unnecessary evidence. But taking the purse and the jacket strongly suggested that Rachel had willingly gathered her things, unlocked the door, and stepped out of the vehicle entirely on her own accord. But why would a deeply happy, completely stable woman pull her car over in the middle of a dark, freezing rural road, leave her keys perfectly sitting in the ignition, and simply vanish into the black, silent woods? Mason stood completely frozen on the side of the dark highway, the flashing red and blue police lights reflecting off his deeply pale, terrified face. The man who had spent his entire life solving the worst mysteries in his county suddenly realized that the most terrifying, completely inexplicable mystery he would ever face had just swallowed the only person he truly loved. The absolute, paralyzing shock of finding Rachel's empty vehicle on the dark county road completely shattered the strict, professional discipline Mason Cole had maintained for 20 years. He stood on the damp gravel shoulder, desperately sweeping his bright flashlight into the dense, silent Indiana woods, screaming his wife's name until his vocal cords were entirely raw. But Mason was a veteran lawman. Even through the massive, suffocating fog of his own absolute terror, he knew exactly how the legal system worked. He knew that as the husband of a missing woman, he was instantly, automatically a primary suspect. To protect the absolute integrity of the investigation, he immediately called the state police headquarters and officially recused himself and his entire local department from leading the case. By sunrise the next morning, the quiet town of Oakhaven had been completely transformed into a massive, highly militarized search zone. Dozens of state troopers, specialized forensic technicians, and highly trained canine tracking teams descended on County Road 9. They strung heavy yellow crime scene tape completely around Rachel's dark blue sport utility vehicle. The tracking dogs were brought directly to the open driver's side door. They picked up Rachel's familiar scent immediately, pulling hard on their heavy leather leashes. But the dogs did not lead the handlers deep into the dense woods. They tracked the scent for exactly 5 feet along the gravel shoulder, and then they completely stopped, turning in confused circles on the wet asphalt. The scent simply vanished into thin air. The senior state detective leading the investigation, a sharp, deeply experienced man named Detective Harris, pulled Mason aside. Harris explained the terrifying reality of the tracking dogs. Rachel had not wandered into the woods. She had absolutely, undeniably gotten into another vehicle right there on the shoulder of the road. Because there were no signs of a violent struggle, no shattered glass, and no defensive wounds left behind in the mud, Detective Harris gently presented a highly disturbing theory. The evidence heavily suggested that Rachel had recognized the person driving the second vehicle. She had willingly gathered her purse and her light spring jacket, left her keys in the ignition, and stepped into their car without fighting. Mason vehemently, fiercely rejected the theory. He looked Detective Harris directly in the eyes, his voice trembling with raw, agonizing emotion. He swore that Rachel was completely happy. They had absolutely no marital problems, no massive financial debts, and no dark secrets. She would never, ever simply walk away from her life. To retrace Rachel's exact movements leading up to the disappearance, state investigators began aggressively pulling security footage from every single commercial building along her route home. They found a massive, critical piece of evidence, just 3 miles down the road from the community center. It was a small, independent gas station. The exterior security camera had successfully captured Rachel's dark blue SUV pulling up to the fuel pumps at exactly 9:15 in the evening. Mason sat in the cramped, heavily crowded back office of the gas station alongside Detective Harris. They watched the grainy, black-and-white VHS footage on a small television monitor. The video showed Rachel stepping out of her vehicle. She looked completely beautiful, wearing her favorite spring dress. She pumped her gas, walked inside the brightly lit convenience store and purchased a bottle of water. But it was her demeanor on the tape that completely broke Mason's heart, while simultaneously deepening the massive mystery for the detectives. Rachel did not look nervous. She was not checking her mirrors, and she was not glancing frantically over her shoulder. As she paid the clerk, she smiled brightly, chatting warmly for a few seconds before walking back to her car. She looked completely relaxed, deeply happy, and entirely at peace. She looked exactly like a woman who was simply driving home to see her husband. 10 minutes after that beautiful smile was captured on tape, her car was completely abandoned on the dark road. The footage completely destroyed the theory that she was being aggressively pursued by a violent stranger. If someone had been tailgating her or trying to run her off the road, she would have looked terrified at the gas station, or she would have asked the clerk to call the police. The investigation quickly hit a massive, unyielding brick wall. The local lakes were heavily dragged, the massive cornfields were searched by state police helicopters, and dozens of interviews were conducted with the charity organizers. Every single lead turned out to be entirely dead. As the agonizing days slowly turned into weeks, the psychological atmosphere inside the quiet town of Oakhaven began to rapidly, toxically change. Human nature despises an unsolved mystery. When a community is faced with a terrifying, inexplicable tragedy, people desperately crave a logical explanation to make themselves feel safe again. The idea that a beloved woman could simply vanish into the dark without a single trace was far too terrifying for the small town to accept. So the town slowly turned its eyes directly toward the grieving husband. The vicious, quiet rumors began to spread like a massive, invisible wildfire. People gathered in the local diners, whispering over their morning coffee. They talked about how statistics always point to the spouse. They whispered that Mason was a powerful sheriff who knew exactly how to completely cover his tracks and dispose of physical evidence. The absolute trust Mason had spent 20 years building in the county began to completely crumble. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the suspicion everywhere he went. When he walked into the local grocery store, the aisles would suddenly go completely silent. People would quickly look away, avoiding eye contact. Even worse, the toxic rumors began to completely infect his own department. Mason noticed his own deputies, the men and women he had trained and mentored for years, suddenly stopping their conversations whenever he walked into the squad room. He was agonizingly isolated, trapped in a massive nightmare where he had lost the love of his life and was now being quietly blamed for her murder. And then, exactly 1 month after Rachel completely vanished, the devastating rumors were violently weaponized. The receptionist at the sheriff's department opened the morning mail and found a plain, cheap white envelope addressed directly to the state police investigators. There was absolutely no return address, and the postmark simply indicated it had been heavily routed through a massive regional sorting facility in a neighboring county. Detective Harris opened the envelope in the secure conference room. Inside was a single, heavily typed piece of standard printer paper. The anonymous letter was incredibly cruel and highly detailed. It claimed that Rachel Cole had been living a massive, completely secret double life. The author wrote that Rachel was deeply unhappy, feeling entirely neglected by a husband who was married to his badge. The letter stated that Rachel had been carrying on a long-term, passionate affair with a man from out of state, and she had deliberately chosen the night of the charity fundraiser to finally run away and start a completely new life. The letter ended with a deeply taunting sentence: "She isn't missing. She is finally free. Stop looking for her." When the anonymous letter was quietly leaked to the local press, the town completely exploded. The terrible gossip was suddenly validated by physical documentation. The massive public pressure forced the state police to completely pivot their investigation, wasting hundreds of crucial hours heavily auditing Rachel's personal bank accounts, pulling years of her phone records, and desperately searching for a secret lover who absolutely never existed. The forensic document examiners at the state laboratory aggressively analyzed the anonymous letter, searching for fingerprints or hidden watermarks. But the paper was entirely generic, and the ink came from a standard, cheap commercial printer. The author was highly intelligent and deeply careful. The letter could not be traced. Mason sat completely alone at his kitchen table late that night, the house suffocatingly quiet. He stared at a photocopy of the anonymous letter, the heavy tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. The letter was an absolute, devastating lie, designed entirely to destroy his wife's beautiful reputation and completely distract the police. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Mason wiped his eyes, his deep sorrow suddenly hardening into a massive, unstoppable wave of fierce, analytical anger. He was a veteran investigator, and he refused to simply be a victim of a cruel prank. He pulled the heavy desk lamp closer, shining the bright light directly onto the typed words. He began reading the letter again, not as a grieving husband, but as a seasoned, deeply experienced lawman hunting a predator. He read the sentences over and over, completely analyzing the specific word choices and the phrasing. And then halfway down the page, his eyes locked onto a single, heavily buried sentence. The author of the letter, attempting to prove they knew Rachel's exact mindset on the night she vanished, had written a highly specific description of her abandoned vehicle. The sentence read, "She was so eager to leave that she didn't even turn the engine off completely. She just left the silver keys turned to the accessory position, leaving the heater blowing warm air, and walked away." Mason completely stopped breathing. The blood entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin completely pale. His hands began to shake violently, entirely rattling the thin piece of paper against the wooden table. He stared at the words accessory position and heater blowing warm air. When Mason had found the dark blue SUV on the gravel shoulder, the engine was indeed turned off. But he remembered perfectly that the silver keys had been left turned exactly halfway in the ignition, and the heavy dashboard fan was still quietly humming, blowing warm air into the cabin. It was a tiny, incredibly minor mechanical detail. But it was a detail that possessed massive, completely terrifying implications. When the state police took over the massive investigation, they had completely sealed the crime scene. They had officially released a public statement confirming that Rachel's vehicle was found abandoned with the keys inside. But they had specifically, intentionally withheld the exact mechanical position of the keys and the operational status of the heater from the local press. It was standard police procedure to hold back minor physical details to weed out false confessions. Absolutely no one in the general public knew that the heater had been left running. The massive, terrifying truth violently crashed over Mason. The author of the anonymous letter was not a random town gossip spreading vicious rumors. The person who wrote the letter possessed exact, undeniable insider knowledge of the physical crime scene. There were only two possible explanations. Either the person who wrote the devastating letter was the exact monster who had stood on the dark highway and abducted Rachel, intentionally writing the letter to completely derail the investigation. Or, far more terrifyingly, the letter had been written by someone deeply embedded inside the active police investigation, actively using highly classified crime scene details to completely manipulate the narrative and hide the truth. Mason stood up in the dark, quiet kitchen, his eyes burning with a massive, fierce realization. The predator wasn't just a random stranger passing through the county. The person who took his wife had been watching him, completely understanding how the police operated, and they were actively, brilliantly playing a massive, highly dangerous psychological game. The massive, terrifying revelation that the anonymous letter had been written by someone with highly classified inside knowledge completely shifted the entire trajectory of the investigation. Mason Cole brought the letter directly to Detective Harris at the State Police Command Center. They locked the heavy wooden door of the conference room and stared at the typed piece of paper. The author knew exactly how Rachel had left the silver keys in the ignition, and they knew the heater was still blowing warm air. Harris immediately realized that the predator was not a random drifter. The kidnapper was someone deeply connected to Oakhaven, someone who either had access to secure police reports, or someone who had a deeply personal, obsessive fixation on Mason himself. The state investigators aggressively pivoted their massive resources. They began conducting a heavy, meticulous audit of Mason Cole's entire 20-year career as a lawman. They pulled thousands of old arrest records, desperately searching for anyone who harbored a severe, life-altering grudge against the respected sheriff. It took weeks of grueling, exhausting archival work, but a young state detective finally uncovered a massive, completely undeniable red flag buried in the county court records. 5 years earlier, in the spring of 1997, Mason had personally arrested a local, highly skilled mechanic named Wade Carter. Wade had been involved in a massive, highly illegal auto theft ring. The arrest was completely standard, and the evidence was absolutely overwhelming. Wade was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary. But for Wade Carter, the prison sentence completely destroyed his entire world. While he was locked behind heavy steel bars, his wife filed for a bitter divorce, packed up their house, and completely moved out of state, taking Wade's young, deeply beloved daughter with her. Wade was entirely stripped of his family, his business, and his freedom. And according to old prison psychological evaluations, Wade completely refused to accept responsibility for his own criminal actions. Instead, he blamed his absolute ruin entirely on the man who had placed the handcuffs on his wrists. He developed a massive, toxic, burning obsession with Sheriff Mason Cole. The most terrifying piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place when Detective Harris checked the recent state parole logs. Wade Carter had been officially released from the state penitentiary exactly 3 weeks before Rachel's dark blue SUV was found abandoned on the rural highway. Heavily armed tactical teams immediately drove to the small, run-down trailer park where Wade was supposed to be living on parole. They kicked the thin metal door completely open, their weapons drawn. But the trailer was entirely empty. The closets were cleared out, and the cheap furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust. Wade Carter had completely vanished from the face of the earth. While the massive police manhunt aggressively scoured the state for the bitter mechanic, the horrifying reality of Rachel's disappearance was unfolding deep inside the dense, heavily isolated Indiana woods. Rachel Cole had not been murdered on the side of the dark county road. When she had pulled up to the rural intersection that evening, Wade Carter had intentionally staged a completely fake breakdown with his vehicle. Because Rachel was a deeply compassionate woman who recognized the former local mechanic, she had willingly put her vehicle in park, left the keys in the ignition, and stepped out to help him. Wade had immediately ambushed her, violently forcing a heavy, chemically soaked cloth over her face. When Rachel finally woke up, she was completely terrified, her head heavily throbbing. She was lying on a small, firm mattress inside a deeply isolated, heavily reinforced hunting cabin. The windows were entirely boarded up with thick, heavy wood. Wade Carter was sitting in a wooden chair across the small room, staring at her with cold, empty eyes. Rachel braced herself for absolutely unimaginable violence, but Wade did not raise his hand. He did not yell. He spoke in a quiet, chillingly calm voice that completely shattered Rachel's understanding of her captivity. "I'm not going to physically hurt you, Rachel," Wade explained calmly, leaning forward in his chair. "You are not here to die. You are here so that your husband can wake up every single morning, walk through a completely empty house, and finally understand exactly what absolute, agonizing loss feels like. He took my family from me. Now I am taking his." The kidnapping was not driven by a desire for physical violence. It was a massive, deeply calculated act of pure psychological warfare. Wade's revenge was completely emotional. Because his revenge had incredibly strict rules, Rachel's captivity was deeply bizarre. Wade did not chain her to the wall. He gave her complete freedom to move around the small, locked interior of the cabin. He provided her with warm clothes, heavy blankets, and proper meals. When she developed a severe chest cold during the first bitter winter, he actively brought her antibiotics and hot tea. He treated her with a strange, highly distorted sense of respect, strictly maintaining her physical health simply to ensure Mason's emotional torture would last a lifetime. But Rachel Cole was an incredibly brilliant, deeply observant woman. She knew that fighting a physically stronger man in a locked, isolated cabin would absolutely result in her death. So she used her greatest natural weapon, her profound, incredible empathy. During the long, agonizing months locked inside the small room, Rachel quietly studied her captor. She noticed that late at night, when Wade thought she was asleep, he would pull a small, heavily wrinkled photograph from his wallet. It was a picture of his young daughter. Wade would stare at the faded image, his shoulders shaking with heavy, silent tears. Rachel realized a massive, powerful truth. Wade Carter was not a completely heartless monster. He was a deeply broken, incredibly damaged father who was completely trapped inside his own toxic obsession. Instead of screaming at him or aggressively fighting him, Rachel slowly, carefully began speaking to him. She asked him gentle questions about his daughter. She treated him like a human being. It was an incredibly dangerous, highly complex psychological tightrope, but Rachel knew that surviving the cabin meant she absolutely had to earn his trust. She had to make him see her as a person, not just a pawn in his revenge. As the agonizing months slowly turned into years, a completely surreal, deeply tragic dynamic formed inside the isolated cabin. The captor and the captive settled into a quiet, heavy routine, entirely cut off from the rest of the world. But on the outside, the passage of time was completely destroying Mason Cole. Years dragged on. 2002 faded heavily into 2005, and then into 2007. The massive, highly coordinated police searches had completely ended. The state investigators quietly boxed up the heavy files and moved them into the dark, dusty archives. Everyone in the county completely believed that Rachel Cole was dead. The toxic rumors that Mason was secretly involved in her disappearance completely eroded his standing in the town. County officials aggressively pressured him to officially declare his wife legally deceased so they could settle her life insurance policies and finalize property taxes. Mason fiercely, absolutely refused. He sat in his quiet, empty farmhouse, entirely refusing to sign the death certificate. But the massive political pressure and the devastating public suspicion finally broke his career. Facing intense demands from the town council, Mason was forced to officially resign as the sheriff of Oakhaven. He packed his silver star into a small wooden box and walked out of the department he had spent his entire life building. His closest deputy was immediately elected as the new sheriff, and the department quietly closed all active efforts on Rachel's case. Mason became an absolute ghost. He lived entirely alone in the farmhouse, his hair turning completely white, his face heavily lined with profound, unending grief. He spent his days endlessly driving the rural county roads, staring out into the massive cornfields, completely trapped in a suffocating purgatory of ambiguous loss. 10 long, agonizing years passed. It was now the spring of 2012. The entire world had moved on. The nightmare of the missing sheriff's wife had become a dark, quiet piece of local history. But in the world of cold cases, hope rarely comes from a brilliant detective. It almost always comes from a completely ordinary person who finally decides to speak up. A local county newspaper decided to run a massive 10-year anniversary retrospective on the famous unsolved mystery. The article covered the initial disappearance, the anonymous letter, and printed the old, faded photographs of the primary suspects, including the local mechanic Wade Carter. Early on a quiet Sunday morning, a 70-year-old retired postal mail carrier named Thomas was sitting at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the local newspaper. When Thomas turned the page and saw the photograph of Wade Carter, he completely froze. His hands began to shake violently, entirely rattling the thin newspaper against the table. Thomas instantly recognized the face, but he didn't know the man as a bitter, missing criminal. Thomas frantically picked up his telephone and called the state police tip line, desperately demanding to speak with the senior detective in charge of the cold case. A few hours later, Detective Harris, who was now heavily grayed and nearing retirement himself, sat across from the retired mail carrier in the local precinct. Mason Cole had been completely left out of the loop, no longer holding a badge or any official authority. Thomas explained his terrifying realization. During the early 2000s, right around the time Rachel vanished, Thomas was driving a highly rural, deeply isolated mail route on the extreme northern edge of the county, heavily bordered by thousands of acres of dense state forest. There was an old, rusted metal drop box at the very end of a broken logging road, Thomas explained, his voice shaking with heavy guilt. I used to deliver generic supply packages there every few weeks. Medical supplies, heavy winter boots, generic clothing. I always saw that exact man waiting near the box to collect the packages. Thomas pointed directly at the newspaper photograph of Wade Carter. I never reported it because I just assumed he was a quiet, harmless guy who wanted to live completely off the grid, Thomas whispered, wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead. I had absolutely no idea he was a wanted fugitive. I never connected his face to the missing woman. Detective Harris felt a massive, explosive surge of pure adrenaline. The ghost had finally made a mistake. Harris immediately secured a high-risk, emergency federal search warrant. He knew he had to tell Mason. He drove directly to the quiet farmhouse and knocked on the heavy wooden door. When Mason heard the news, the 10 years of absolute, crushing despair completely vanished from his eyes, instantly replaced by a massive, fierce fire. He grabbed his heavy jacket and demanded to ride in the front seat of the command vehicle. Before we continue, if you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, a massive convoy of completely blacked out, heavily armored state police vehicles aggressively drove toward the extreme northern edge of the county. They turned off their headlights and navigated the deeply broken logging road entirely by the pale light of the moon. They arrived at the rusted metal drop box just as the sun began to rise over the heavy pine trees. The tactical team silently advanced on foot through the dense, thorny brush for nearly 2 miles, completely surrounding a small, heavily decaying wooden hunting cabin perfectly hidden in the center of a deep ravine. The cabin looked incredibly weathered. The roof was partially caved in, and the heavy wooden boards covering the windows were deeply rotted. The SWAT commander gave the silent hand signal. A heavy steel battering ram violently smashed into the solid wooden door, completely tearing it off its rusted iron hinges. Heavily armed officers flooded into the dark, echoing structure, sweeping their bright white tactical flashlights across the shadows, loudly screaming for everyone to get on the ground. Mason rushed through the shattered doorway, his heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm, desperately hopping to see his wife. But as the bright lights completely illuminated the small, single-room cabin, the absolute, devastating reality of the raid violently crashed over the entire team. The cabin was completely, entirely abandoned. There was no Wade Carter, and there was no Rachel. The small mattress in the corner was completely stripped bare. The wooden shelves were entirely empty. The thick layer of heavy, undisturbed dust covering the wooden floorboards proved that absolutely no one had lived inside the structure for several years. Mason collapsed heavily against the doorframe, a massive, agonizing groan of pure devastation tearing from his throat. They had missed her. The 10-year-old clue had led them directly to an empty grave. But Detective Harris refused to leave empty-handed. He ordered his forensic technicians to aggressively tear the rotting cabin completely apart. A young technician began meticulously sweeping the wooden floorboards. Near the back corner of the room, hidden entirely beneath the small, rusted bed frame, he noticed a single wooden plank that was slightly raised above the others. The technician used a heavy steel crowbar to violently pry the wooden board completely upward. He shined his flashlight down into the dark, narrow gap between the floor and the damp earth. Resting quietly in the dark hole, entirely protected by several layers of thick, heavy plastic bags, was a massive stack of small, spiral-bound notebooks. Detective Harris carefully pulled the plastic bags out of the floor and opened them. Mason rushed over, his breathing frantic and heavy. He looked down at the notebooks. They were journals. Every single page was completely filled with dense, meticulous, beautiful handwriting. Mason recognized the loops and the elegant script immediately. It was Rachel's handwriting. She had survived. She had spent years locked inside the dark cabin, completely cut off from the world, and she had secretly, desperately documented every single day of her captivity, entirely believing that someone would eventually find her words. Detective Harris opened the very last notebook in the stack, flipping directly to the final, frantic entries. But as the seasoned detective read the faded ink, the expression on his face completely changed. He did not look relieved. He looked deeply, profoundly terrified. The journals did not describe a violent, bloody escape. They described a massive, highly psychological shift in the captor. Rachel had repeatedly written that Wade Carter had actively, desperately wanted to let her go for years. He had packed his bags. He had unlocked the heavy door. But every single time he tried to release her, a sudden, terrifying panic would completely overcome him, and he would violently lock the door again. And according to the absolute final entry in the journal, that panic had driven Wade to suddenly force Rachel into a vehicle in the middle of the night, permanently abandoning the cabin and moving her to a completely new, entirely unknown location, driven by a secret so terrifying it had completely shattered his mind. The massive stack of spiral-bound notebooks resting on the rotting floorboards completely changed the entire reality of the 10-year-old cold case. Mason Cole knelt in the dust of the abandoned hunting cabin, his hands trembling as he gently touched the heavy pages filled with his wife's beautiful, flawless handwriting. Rachel was not just a victim who had vanished in the dark. She was a brilliant, incredibly resilient survivor who had spent years documenting a terrifying, deeply complex psychological nightmare. Detective Harris carefully bagged the journals and rushed them directly to the State Police Command Center. Over the next 48 hours, forensic psychologists and senior investigators meticulously read every single word Rachel had written. What they discovered completely shattered their understanding of the bitter, missing mechanic. Wade Carter was not a cold, calculated monster executing a flawless physical torture. He was a deeply shattered, completely paranoid father who was drowning in his own toxic obsession. Rachel's journals revealed that over the years, Wade had repeatedly, desperately wanted to let her go. He knew that his revenge had not healed his pain. It had only built a second, invisible prison for himself. Rachel had documented multiple agonizing nights where Wade would unlock the heavy wooden door, pack a small bag for her, and tell her she was finally going home. But every single time, right before she could step out into the trees, a massive, terrifying panic would completely overwhelm him. Wade knew that if he let her go, Rachel would go directly to the police. He would be arrested, convicted of a massive federal kidnapping charge, and locked in a concrete cell for the absolute rest of his natural life. And if he went back to prison, he would completely, permanently lose the one thing he was desperately trying to get back: his daughter. But the final pages of the journal detailed a sudden, violent shift in Wade's behavior. Rachel wrote that one afternoon, Wade returned to the cabin holding a single crumpled piece of paper. He looked entirely terrified, his hands shaking violently. He wept for hours in the dark. The very next morning, he aggressively boarded up the windows, forced Rachel into his vehicle, and permanently abandoned the cabin, completely panicked and running completely blind. Investigators needed to know exactly what was on that piece of paper. They aggressively tracked down Wade's ex-wife and his now-grown daughter, Emily, who were living quietly in a neighboring state. Detective Harris and Mason drove hundreds of miles to sit down in Emily's quiet living room. Emily was now a beautiful woman in her late 20s. She had grown up completely alienated from her father, entirely believing he had abandoned her after going to prison. When Harris gently asked if she had ever tried to contact Wade, Emily burst into heavy, agonizing tears. She confessed a massive, heartbreaking secret. Years earlier, desperate for answers about her broken childhood, Emily had quietly hired a private investigator to find her father. The investigator had managed to trace Wade to a highly secure, rural post office box in northern Indiana. Emily had written him a single, deeply emotional letter. "I told him I knew he was out there," Emily wept, hiding her face in her hands. "I told him I would finally agree to meet him, but only under one absolute condition. I demanded that he take full responsibility for what he had done. I told him he had to confess to everything and stop blaming other people for his mistakes. If he did that, I would forgive him." Mason sat completely frozen on the sofa. The massive, tragic puzzle completely snapped into place. Wade had received the letter. His daughter, the only person he loved in the entire world, had finally reached out to him. She had offered him the exact forgiveness he had spent a decade desperately craving. But Wade had completely panicked. He knew that taking full responsibility meant confessing to kidnapping the beloved wife of the former sheriff. It meant an immediate, massive prison sentence. He was completely trapped between the desperate desire to see his daughter and the absolute, paralyzing terror of dying in a concrete cell. Instead of choosing the truth, Wade had chosen fear. He had packed up the cabin and moved Rachel completely off the grid again, running deeper into the shadows. But Emily provided the investigators with one final, incredibly vital piece of information that would ultimately break the entire case wide open. Before her parents had divorced, Wade had been diagnosed with severe, early-onset diabetes. He required heavy, highly specific daily doses of insulin to simply survive. Detective Harris immediately mobilized a massive, statewide data sweep. He knew that Wade was living completely off the grid under a fake identity. He could not visit a major hospital or use modern medical insurance. He would be entirely forced to purchase his heavy insulin supplies using pure cash at small, independent, rural pharmacies that did not ask questions. The state police subpoenaed years of financial records and customer logs from hundreds of small farming towns across the Midwest. They cross-referenced cash purchases of specific diabetic medications with the physical description of Wade Carter. It was a grueling, agonizing needle in a massive haystack. But a week later, a sharp, highly observant clerk working at an old, dusty independent pharmacy in a deeply remote farming community in southern Indiana called the tip line. The clerk had seen the updated, age-progressed photograph of Wade Carter on the evening news. He told investigators that the man in the picture came into the pharmacy on the first Tuesday of every single month. He always paid in cash. He never spoke more than a few words, and he always bought massive, incredibly expensive amounts of specialized insulin. But the clerk mentioned a highly specific, deeply crucial detail. Over the past year, the man's physical health had completely, visibly deteriorated. He was walking with a heavy cane, he looked incredibly frail, and his breathing was shallow and labored. As Detective Harris and Mason aggressively sped down the southern highway toward the remote farming community, they began to heavily analyze the massive psychological implications of Wade's failing health. If Wade Carter was so physically sick and frail that he could barely walk into a pharmacy, how was he successfully keeping a healthy, intelligent woman completely trapped inside a locked cabin? He no longer had the physical strength to overpower her. The terrifying, profoundly tragic reality of the situation slowly settled over Mason's brilliant mind. Rachel was no longer just a captive. For 10 years she had lived entirely alone with a broken, heavily damaged man. She had recognized his humanity, and she had survived by treating him with incredible empathy. But as Wade's body began to completely fail him, he could no longer maintain the prison. He could no longer care for himself. The relationship between the captor and the captive had completely, fundamentally transformed into something absolutely unimaginable. Rachel had become his caretaker. She was managing his insulin injections. She was feeding him when he was too weak to stand. They were no longer simply a kidnapper and a victim. They were two deeply traumatized, entirely isolated people who were completely trapped by the consequences of one terrible, irreversible decision, relying entirely on each other simply to survive in the dark. Rachel could have let him die. She could have walked out the door and let the diabetic coma completely consume him. But Rachel Cole was the warm, beating heart of her community. She possessed an incredible, unshakable moral compass. She refused to become a monster, even to the man who had stolen 10 years of her life. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. State police investigators swarmed the quiet farming town, establishing a massive, completely invisible perimeter. They tracked Wade's old, rusted vehicle from the pharmacy directly back to a massive, deeply decaying farm property sitting at the end of a heavily overgrown, rutted dirt road. The property was entirely surrounded by dead corn stalks and rotting wooden fences. At the absolute center of the farm sat a small, deeply weathered, heavily isolated farmhouse. This was the second cabin. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, freezing fog began to lift off the dead fields. The massive convoy of heavily armored SWAT vehicles, state police cruisers, and emergency medical ambulances drove silently down the dirt road, cutting their engines and rolling to a quiet stop entirely out of sight. Mason Cole stepped out of the command vehicle, his heart pounding a frantic, completely deafening rhythm against his ribs. He unclipped his heavy tactical flashlight, his hands trembling violently. After 10 years of endless, suffocating grief, he was finally standing just a few hundred yards away from his wife. The tactical team slowly, silently surrounded the rotting farmhouse. They moved with absolute, flawless precision through the tall, dead grass, their heavy rifles raised and completely ready. They did not know exactly what they would find inside. They did not know if Wade Carter was heavily armed, or if the paranoid, bitter man would use Rachel as a human shield in a massive, final standoff. The SWAT commander grabbed a heavy metal bullhorn. He stood behind the armored steel door of a police truck, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet, freezing farm. Wade Carter, this is the state police. The property is completely surrounded. Walk out the front door with your hands completely empty. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed the announcement was absolutely agonizing. Mason gripped the edge of the police truck, staring at the dark, weathered front door of the farmhouse, completely holding his breath. For 2 minutes, absolutely nothing happened. The house remained completely, entirely dark. And then the heavy wooden front door slowly clicked open. The tactical officers aggressively raised their weapons, loudly screaming for the suspect to show his hands. The man who slowly stepped out onto the rotting wooden porch did not look like a dangerous, terrifying monster. He did not look like the bitter, angry mechanic Mason had arrested 15 years ago. Wade Carter looked incredibly, completely broken. He was heavily grayed, his shoulders slumped deeply forward. He was incredibly thin, leaning heavily against a wooden cane just to keep himself standing. He was wearing an oversized flannel shirt that hung loosely off his frail frame. He did not raise a weapon. He slowly, weakly raised his empty hands into the freezing morning air. He looked directly across the yard, his tired, heavy eyes locking instantly onto Mason Cole, who was standing beside the police truck. Wade did not look angry. He simply looked incredibly, profoundly exhausted. The 10-year psychological war he had waged had completely destroyed him from the inside out. Wade took one slow, trembling step forward. He did not yell. He spoke in a quiet, incredibly fragile voice that carried across the heavy silence of the farm. "She's inside," Wade whispered, the heavy tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. "Please don't scare her." The tactical officers rushed forward, securing the frail, broken man and gently lowering him to the damp grass. But Mason Cole did not look at the man who had ruined his life. He pushed completely past the heavily armed officers, running desperately up the rotting wooden steps, throwing the front door completely open, and stepping out of the freezing daylight and directly into the dark. The air inside the dark, decaying farmhouse was completely thick, smelling heavily of wood smoke, old dust, and sharp antiseptic. Mason Cole stepped slowly across the threshold, his heavy tactical boots completely silent against the rotting floorboards. He unclipped his bright flashlight, sweeping the white beam gently across the small, highly isolated room. The interior was heavily cluttered but meticulously clean. There were small stacks of well-worn books, a small iron wood stove radiating a gentle heat, and a small wooden table covered entirely with clear plastic bottles of heavy diabetic medication. Mason slowly turned his flashlight toward the far corner of the room. Sitting quietly in a small, worn armchair, heavily wrapped in a thick, faded patchwork quilt, was a woman. She raised her hand, shielding her eyes from the bright, blinding light of the doorway. Her hands were completely shaking. Mason lowered his flashlight immediately, letting the soft, gray morning light filter through the open doorway. He stared across the small room. The woman sitting in the chair was not the vibrant, energetic 48-year-old library volunteer who had smiled so brightly on the gas station security camera 10 years ago. Her long, dark hair was now heavily streaked with completely solid white and gray. Her face was deeply weathered, carrying the absolute, profound exhaustion of a decade spent completely isolated from the outside world. She looked incredibly fragile, her shoulders slumped beneath the heavy quilt. But as she slowly lowered her trembling hand and looked toward the large silhouette standing in the doorway, Mason instantly, completely recognized the beautiful, familiar brown eyes that had haunted his dreams every single night for 10 agonizing years. "Mason," Her voice was a tiny, fragile whisper, completely cracking in the heavy, silent air. Mason's entire world completely stopped spinning. The heavy badge he had worn for decades, the toxic rumors, the massive, suffocating grief, everything instantly evaporated into pure, absolute dust. He dropped his heavy flashlight onto the wooden floorboards. He fell directly to his knees in front of her chair. "Rachel," Mason choked out, his voice completely shattering into a raw, agonizing sob. "I'm here. I'm right here." He reached out, his strong hands completely trembling, entirely terrified that if he touched her, the beautiful illusion would violently shatter, and he would wake up completely alone in his empty house again. But Rachel reached forward, her small, trembling hands gently gripping the heavy, rough fabric of his winter jacket. It was completely real. Mason wrapped his massive arms completely around her fragile frame, burying his face directly into her shoulder. The heavy, unyielding dam of profound, ambiguous loss that had entirely trapped him in a suffocating purgatory for a decade finally, violently broke. He wept with a massive, entirely uncontrollable devastation. He held her incredibly tightly, completely terrified to ever let her go again. Rachel rested her head against his chest, the heavy, silent tears openly flooding her weathered cheeks. The 10-year psychological nightmare, the heavily reinforced hunting cabins, the terrifying isolation, and the incredibly complex, twisted relationship with her captor finally melted away into the warm, absolute safety of her husband's arms. "You found me," Rachel whispered, crying softly into his jacket. "I always knew you would never stop looking. I always knew." Within hours, Rachel was safely transported to a highly secure, modern medical facility. She was surrounded by female state troopers and completely shielded from the massive, explosive media frenzy that erupted the moment the state police officially announced they had found the sheriff's wife completely alive. The entire town of Oakhaven was completely rocked to its absolute core. The quiet diners and the community centers were filled with profound, heavy shock. The massive, toxic rumors that had completely destroyed Mason's life and forced him to resign his badge were instantly exposed as absolute, vicious lies. The citizens who had quietly turned their backs on him were suddenly forced to confront their own massive, terrifying guilt. While Rachel was resting comfortably in the hospital, the final, absolutely devastating chapter of the 10-year nightmare was unfolding deep inside the state police precinct. Wade Carter was sitting heavily in a cold, sterile interrogation room. The frail, deeply sick man was hooked up to a small, portable medical monitor, completely surrounded by seasoned state detectives. Wade did not try to deny anything. He looked completely defeated, entirely exhausted by the massive psychological war he had waged against the world. He calmly confessed to staging the vehicle breakdown, aggressively abducting Rachel, and completely hiding her off the grid for a decade. He explained the heavily isolated cabins, the anonymous letter he had typed on a cheap printer to intentionally destroy Mason's reputation, and his own terrifying inability to finally let her go. But Wade Carter still clung desperately to one massive, final delusion. Even as he sat in handcuffs, facing a guaranteed life sentence, he looked up at Detective Harris with bitter, empty eyes. "He destroyed my life first," Wade whispered, his voice rattling heavily in his chest. "Mason Cole set me up. He planted the evidence. He took my wife and my daughter away from me. I just wanted him to feel exactly what it felt like to have your entire family completely stolen by a lie." Detective Harris stared at the broken, frail man. Harris had spent the last 24 hours heavily reviewing the absolute entire history of Wade Carter's original 1997 criminal arrest. Harris slowly opened a heavy, thick cardboard file folder and placed it directly onto the metal interrogation table. "Wade," Detective Harris said, his voice completely lacking any anger, filled only with a profound, heavy pity. "You need to look at this." Harris slid the original, heavily documented police reports across the table. Mason Cole never framed you, Harris explained calmly. He never planted a single piece of evidence. Your own partners in the auto theft ring completely turned on you. They wore hidden wires. They provided the state prosecutors with heavy, undeniable audio recordings of you actively orchestrating the crimes. Mason was just the uniform who was ordered to place the handcuffs on your wrists. Wade stared at the aging, yellowed police reports. The color completely, rapidly drained from his heavily lined face. Harris gently pressed the absolute, devastating truth completely home. Your wife didn't leave you because of Mason Cole, Harris continued, his voice echoing heavily in the quiet room. She left you because she found out you were heavily involved in organized crime. She completely took Emily away to protect her from your massive mistakes. Your entire life fell apart entirely because of your own choices. Wade Carter's trembling hands slowly touched the old, undeniable physical evidence. The massive, completely terrifying reality violently crashed over his entire existence. For 15 long years, he had completely refused to accept responsibility for his own actions. He had built a massive, highly toxic narrative of victimhood, entirely convincing himself that an innocent sheriff had ruined his life. He had stolen a beautiful, innocent woman. He had tortured a good, highly respected man for a decade. He had completely destroyed his own health, running entirely off the grid in the dark. And it was all based on an absolute, complete lie that he had told himself. The realization completely broke Wade Carter. The heavy, frail man dropped his head onto the metal table and wept with a massive, entirely uncontrollable agony. He had completely wasted his entire life, and he had permanently destroyed his only chance to ever see his daughter again, entirely for a revenge that was built on pure, complete delusion. Realizing the absolute truth had come far, far too late. The following month, Wade Carter accepted a massive, consecutive life sentence without the absolute possibility of parole, completely waiving his right to any legal appeals. Before he was permanently transferred to a highly secure federal medical prison facility, Wade handed Detective Harris a thick, heavily tied stack of old, worn envelopes. They were the secret birthday letters he had written to Emily every single year for a decade, the ones he had been far too terrified to ever mail. He had written one final, new letter to place on the very top of the stack. It contained a massive, deeply detailed confession, taking absolute, complete responsibility for every single terrible choice he had ever made, and begging his daughter for her forgiveness. He finally chose the absolute truth over blame. Mason Cole's name was completely, entirely cleared. The town of Oakhaven issued a massive, highly public formal apology to the former sheriff. The county officials who had aggressively forced his resignation begged him to return to his post. The deputies who had whispered behind his back could barely look him in the eyes, completely overwhelmed by their own massive shame. But Mason completely declined to return to the department. He didn't care about the Silver Star anymore. He only cared about his wife. Rachel Cole finally returned to the quiet, peaceful farmhouse. But the emotional reunion, while incredibly beautiful, was absolutely not simple. When a person is completely removed from the world for 10 years, the heavy, suffocating trauma does not instantly vanish the moment they walk back through their front door. The farmhouse had been completely frozen in time. Mason had kept her clothes in the exact same drawers, and her favorite coffee mug was still sitting exactly where she had left it. But Rachel had profoundly, fundamentally changed. She was hypervigilant. She struggled heavily with the massive crowds in the local grocery store. She had spent a decade constantly managing the intense, highly complex psychology of a broken captor, completely transforming into his reluctant caretaker to survive. Reintegrating into a completely normal, quiet life was incredibly terrifying. And Mason had changed as well. He had spent a decade living as an absolute ghost, heavily hardening his heart to survive the suffocating grief. Even after all those years, completely rebuilding a marriage that had been violently frozen in time proved to be significantly harder than either of them had ever expected. There were incredibly difficult nights. There were heavy, quiet moments of absolute, overwhelming anxiety. They were two deeply traumatized people who had to completely learn how to love each other all over again. But they absolutely refused to give up. They attended heavy, highly specialized trauma counseling together. They spent quiet, peaceful afternoons walking slowly through the massive Indiana cornfields, holding hands and completely focusing on the beautiful, bright future they had finally been given back. The story of the sheriff's wife who completely vanished on a quiet county road stands as a chilling, profoundly tragic reminder of the absolute, devastating danger of toxic obsession. It proves that refusing to accept responsibility for your own mistakes can easily mutate into a massive, heavily destructive force that completely consumes everything in its path. But far more importantly, it remains an immortal, incredibly powerful testament to the indestructible nature of absolute truth and the massive resilience of the human spirit. Wade Carter spent a decade believing that his heavily calculated revenge would bring him peace, but revenge absolutely never heals pain. It only builds completely invisible prisons, trapping innocent people inside the darkness, until someone is finally brave enough to choose the light. Rachel Coles survived the absolute darkest, most terrifying nightmare imaginable completely through the massive power of her own empathy. She refused to become a monster, and Mason Coles survived a decade of absolute, crushing despair entirely through his fierce, unyielding love. 10 agonizing years could not completely break them. The dark woods could not permanently hide them. Ultimately, the profound, unshakable power of true love will always, eventually, completely destroy the heavy chains of the past, completely conquer the darkness, and finally guide the deeply lost ones safely back home.